So welcome to everyone joining us for this event, Creativity in the Lockdown Home. Thank you very much, everyone, for making the time to attend. My name is Stephen Barber, and along with Professor Fran Lloyd, I'm one of the co-directors of the Visual Material Culture Research Centre at Kingston School of Art faculty. It's one of 4 research centres based there, and it's a centre spanning research into contemporary cultures, cultural histories, art, film, photography, fashion, craft, digital media. And one of our ongoing projects is to explore imageries and concepts of home. And this connects to one of the centre's ongoing international research projects directed by Fran Lloyd with Azadeh Fatehrad, titled Making It Home, on the study of migrant homemaking and the politics of integration. So today's event is the second of a series of 3. The final one will be coming up on the evening of the 10th of June. This one will be looking at the homes of the Kingston-based artists Dora Gordine and Edward Muybridge. That event will be in 2 parts, as with today's event. There'll be plenty of time for questions at the end of the presentations. And the event is being recorded for our YouTube channel. So it's best to turn off your cameras during the presentations, please. I think everyone has got their cameras turned off anyway, and this helps with the showing the PowerPoint images. So now I'm going to hand you over to Lina Hakim to introduce her part of the events, the first part of the events, and then we'll hear from Daisy later. Yeah, thank you very much.
Hi, thanks, Stephen. Thanks, everyone, for being here. So Anna and me, this section we'll be talking about is our working title is Child-Led Creative Disruption in the Lockdown Family Home. And I'll introduce Anna and myself and tell you a bit more about what we're planning to talk about and how we're thinking of doing it. So Anna Johnson's a PhD candidate in creative writing. Her practice is one of poetic prose life writing, and her research is at the intersection of maternal studies, disability and illness studies, neurodiversity and queer theory. And what Anna's interested in is exploring the complexity and ambivalence of early motherhood and looking into ways of articulating this kind of experience and related experiences. My name is Lina Hakim. I'm a teacher and a researcher at Kingston, and my focus is usually on the material cultures of science, technology, craft, and play. But I am also a mother, and I've been thinking a lot lately about ways in which to foreground that part of my life, that kind of experience of parenthood, which I think it would make sense to bring into my work, my research, my practice, especially if I'm thinking about it as something that's self-reflective, situated, etc. And so what we'll be talking about today, the object of our chat, is this phenomenon that has become a lot more visible since lockdown, particularly in households who were, able to work from home. And it's that kind of merger of spheres, of the professional and the domestic sphere, this kind of foregrounding of care, the messiness that's involved with it, the rhythms of children and childhood, and all of that kind of labor that goes into it. And we thought for our discussion today, it is going to be a discussion, so it's not very structured, but we've got a few key themes that I'm about to post, I think. There we go. In the chat, and these are the key ideas we'll be working around. So the idea of messiness and boundaries, the notion of care, the notion of failure, which is unavoidable, inescapable, ideas around time and temporalities, play, and this notion of letting go. And throughout our discussion, we'll be looking at or underlying this discussion is ways of thinking of how this can feed into, or how these ideas, these experiences can feed into our creative and research practice, and how we can try and embrace and make sense of the kind of meaning making, I guess, that happens in these spheres. So I don't know, do you want to, Anna, start talking about or kick things off with this idea of messiness and boundaries, which we thought would be good for explaining how we arrived at this and how we can fit into it.
Yeah, yeah. I think, as you say, there are some boundaries between things like sort of work and family home that COVID really, especially the lockdown, highlighted. But I think when we discussed this before, we were talking about the fact that those boundaries have always been very messy and problematic, especially for women and mothers, or other people with caring responsibilities of all different kinds. So I think, yeah, this idea that there are these strict boundaries, but really there never have been, and it's. I think we were talking about kind of trying to use this as a chance to highlight that and to really see if there's any way we can build on the fact that people are becoming a little more aware of that. Though I still think much less aware than they need to be.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I was really at the beginning of I don't know if enjoying is the right word, but having our kids in the background kind of clambering on us while we were trying to have, work meetings, research conversations, etc. I thought was something, yeah, maybe not very practical, but really nice, really rich. And I think it made it more easier for us to discuss this aspect of our lives in terms of how it relates or how it affects our work. But I know that both of us are also interested in ways in which it is actually part of the work. And I quite, yeah, I mean, I'm just at the beginning of exploring that. I know obviously with your practice, that's really the focus of it.
Yeah, so my research practice and my writing practice entirely came out of having a kid and having a huge need to find a creative way to express what seems to be something quite difficult to talk about. And when I started researching it, it seemed quite apparent that lots of other people find it difficult to talk about, and there are people who are. There's a huge gap, I think, where it's just not spoken about because it's difficult, and there are people who are trying in very interesting and kind of creative ways to talk about motherhood experience, like Lisa Baretza and Denise Riley, so in very different ways. So there's these little pockets of people trying to do this stuff, but I feel like it's still quite elusive finding a way. So yeah, I've been doing that since 2016. So I've been sort of writing, and then it kind of spiraled into a PhD. But then obviously lockdown just added a different layer, and I think we're coming to that slightly differently, because for me lockdown made it much harder to be creative, and I essentially had to pause my PhD studies because I was home on my own with my child, and yeah, suddenly that became kind of even more problematic than the kind of challenges of working in that way anyway. And I think I'm still processing that. We were talking about that as well, weren't we? That yeah. I think a lot of people are still trying to process that time. I feel like you've been doing, because you wrote a piece, didn't you, about that was, I think, perhaps part of your way of beginning to process that. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think so. I meant to copy the links to the pieces. Oh, there we go. So I'll put these in the chat if anyone's interested in looking at these. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, so these are two. Yeah, it looks like one link, but it's actually two texts. One that Anna's written, especially around this idea of failure, and one that I've written about, well, things in lockdown and our way of negotiating our lives around things and like that. And I think, I mean, two of the things that you just brought up, Anna. Sorry, and there's a comment by David. Please, anyone who would like to turn their cameras on, please do. Yes, we love seeing reactions to our conversation on people's faces. Hello. Yeah, there's these two things, right? This sense of there something to process, right? Something to really needing to make sense of. There's this sense of I mean, frustration with the literature around parenthood and motherhood that's just that reinforces ideas around failure that we'll probably touch on next, but also the sense that there's something that's really meaningful, powerful, that needs addressing, that needs spending time with as an idea, that needs researching, exploring, and the fact that there are no actual ways of doing or established ways of doing it, which might be a strength in a way, right? Because a lot of, yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, I guess this kind of thinking even is about reclaiming something about that space, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it circles back to the idea of creativity. I don't think there's a simple or easy way to talk about motherhood. I don't think there's a simple or easy way to talk about our experiences of COVID, which obviously hugely varied. I think these are all really sort of intense, affect-laden, ambivalent, complex experiences, human experiences. So I think to find ways to talk about those, we're probably going to have to get pretty creative, I think. That's my feeling.
Yeah. And acknowledge, I guess, what you were saying about the diversity of experiences, acknowledge the specific positions, acknowledge particular, body situations, ideas around feminism obviously underlies a lot of this, but, intersectionality, all of these kinds of contextual issues that become really part of it.
Yeah, and I think especially around motherhood, when I think the boundaries even between individual people, which are messy at best, but become really, really complex and kind of. Actually, I had a quote from Stephen Frosch that I was gonna see if I can paste this in the chat. That I think might be kind of interesting there. I'll give you a second to read.
Do you want to read it out, or?
Yeah, I can read it out. So this is Stephen Frosch from a book called Haunting Psychoanalysis and Ghostly Transmissions, because I'm very interested in ghosts and the sort of literary ideas of ghosts and haunting. But so he says, otherness constitutes us as beings that can lose track of ourselves and of our boundaries. We can fade and flow as subjects and be troubled and excited by such experiences at one and the same time. And I think that's something that motherhood highlights in particular, this sort of like when I was brushing my son's teeth last night and I was trying to make sure I brushed the tooth at the back really well because of my sore wisdom tooth. And it was in my head, I just wasn't sure whose teeth I was brushing in that moment. And I think that those kind of things, and I imagine that for some people, perhaps people who were very lonely as well during lockdown, this sort of flow of us as not fully individuated people, because nobody is, it's just not how humans work, sort of having that removed and all of these things, I think it probably makes for an interesting discussion. So.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, that whole the merger, I think the communal merger is something, but also that whole the where they start and where you end and where they start, or vice versa, is an interesting one with parenthood, isn't it? I mean, that whole I still find it funny when my mom puts a jacket on me because she's cold, and then you find yourself doing the exact same thing, don't you? It's kind of that constant. Oh no, I know they're feeling a bit warm now because I am. How does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's like it's the kind of merging of our kind of boundaries around the sort of social structures of work and home life and stuff, but also just in a bodily way as well. It's kind of very complicated, I think, and important to kind of address it from all of those levels, I think, if we can. But again, that's going to involve quite a lot of creativity, I think, to find a way to talk about that that honors the complexity of all that experience.
And I think, I guess, a lot of it, and we spoke about that last time as well, a lot of it has to do with this notion of care, with the idea of care. I can see Nicola in the chat is talking about putting a jacket on her mom. I mean, care in its many dimensions.
Absolutely.
And its invisibility and the politics of it, and the structures of power involved in it, I think.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Actually, I have another quote, if you don't mind. I think is relevant and kind of takes us on to that that second section.
Actually,
can I read that out, or did you want to post something as well?
Yeah, no, please read it out. I was going to post a definition about the politics of care as well. I'll do it after this, which I quite like.
Yeah. So this is from Lisa Breitzer, who writes on motherhood and wider care and psychosocial stuff. Love itself is always already ambivalent, being experienced as distinct from destructiveness at the very point that one can recognize that the two have come together. When we come to understand, that is, that care entails understanding failures of care. So in order to you know, for Nicola to want to put the coat on her mother, she needs to know, she needs to understand what will happen if she doesn't, and she needs to understand that that's not necessarily something her mother is capable of knowing she needs to do right now. And so it's when you're caring, when you're sort of performing this caring labor, you're holding so much failure and often very dark thoughts, and very, you know, you have to have such an awareness of what happens if that care fails, which again became very obvious during COVID, because so much care failed because of the government. So
yeah, had to. Oh, it's so beautiful that care entails understanding failures of care. It's such a nice way of capturing I guess the flip side of this idea of lack of boundaries and leakiness, this fact that we aren't actually an extension of one another. We can't completely understand the needs, and even if we did, we can't always be there for these kinds of things. We can't always. Yeah, absolutely. It's such a good quote. I my reference is a bit. That was something that was. I don't know if anyone's aware of this, so I'll put the reference. The Pirate Care Syllabus. It was a project about online dimensions of care, what we can do. So again, it was spurred by lockdown, and it's a really interesting reference. I've put a link there to the website as well. But they've got this these points about this definition about care as a political notion that I thought was very important, particularly in the way in which it understands how exclusionary practices of care can be on both sides, ways of making the labor of care visible and this kind of thing. I mean, it's related also, I guess, to ideas around emotional labor that we really think about when we think about parenting, motherhood, childhood, ways of managing. And I think I've got the reference for.
I've just seen Nicola's comment and I agree wholeheartedly.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, on that point, that's what Eiley Russell Hochschild talks about. In The Managed Heart, there's a chapter on emotional labor, which talks about it's not her focus isn't things like parenthood. It's the kind of structural oppressions in jobs and roles where managing your emotions is an intrinsic part of the work, of the labor. Yeah, definitely. Again, a reason why it's so, well, why we, I guess, feel it's so important to talk about these things, to make them visible, but also to maybe theorize these things, intellectualize them. I don't know what the right.
Well, I think that there's a book I've just started to read, so I don't know a great deal about it, but called The Capacity to Care by Wendy Holway, and it's sort of trying to break down that assumption that we all have the capacity to care, and that care, especially women, which is, you know, it's assumed that that we're all able to. So yeah, I think it's sort of looking at some of those social structures and family structures, and how we come to a point where we can care. And I think, yeah, it's very interesting. I didn't really have time to read the whole thing, but the your numbered list about the Pirate Care syllabus. I mean, it just seems like it's really interestingly problematizing the idea of care, like that it's not intrinsically nice, and that it always involves power relations. And
oh yeah, and a negotiation. I mean, we were talking a lot of, you mentioned at the beginning this kind of balancing act, but it's also negotiation with, the reason for the requirement for that balancing act is structures, things that are taken for granted, things that aren't interrogated. And I think that's where, when you were in your text, the reference that I've put at the beginning, when you talk about failure, you talk about what this kind of, how we can reclaim this failure as something that makes these imbalances or these power structures visible in a way, or maybe as something that we can reclaim as something that's active. This idea of active failure. Yeah,
I think I was so yet another quote from this one in. So that idea about sort of reclaiming failure, I stole from Jack Halberstam from the Queer Art of Failure, which again they are talking about what failure shows us, how it shows us the kind of holes in structures, and that there are other ways of doing it, even if those ways feel like failures, which they so often do when they should be reframed as something else, really. I think I also have another, sorry, so many quotes. I'll just read that one out. We can recognize failure as a way of refusing to acquiesce to dominant logics of power and discipline, and as a form of critique. So I think that's, and then I have another lovely one from, I don't know why everything's coming out highlighted. Anyway, I don't know. It looks weird in my screen. I don't know if it does on yours. But this is from Julia Lane, who put together a book about motherhood and affect, which I had a chapter in. But she writes, the demands made on mothers by the institution of motherhood are impossible to achieve, which accounts for why failure has come to be seen as an inevitable part of motherhood. But the second part of the quote, I think, is the bit that's most significant here. Is she says, moreover, to succeed within such an institution means to be deemed successful by inherently misogynistic, racist and classist measures. So I think what she's saying is that you can't succeed anyway, but if you did, you'd just be upholding those systems, and actually, rather than us all just feeling huge shame for these kind of failures that we feel that we are performing in daily motherhood
constantly.
If we start to see them as actually rebellions or positive actions against these broken systems and structures, then maybe that can be more creative and more positive. To kind of bring it back to creativity.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think it's something we were maybe forced to do in lockdown. I mean, I know you said that you didn't have the space for creative work on the project, but there's probably that kind of giving into the failures, everything that wasn't going to work, right? All of that balancing act was never going to work in lockdown, and then kind of embracing the mess, embracing the play, embracing these kinds of structures where something that the children care about, I mean, that's why play, right? Something that they take in utmost seriousness for very understandable reason is actually not frivolous, is actually the thing that's in the foreground. It's actually the thing that you're completely 100% part of, engaged in, becomes something, it feels radical, doesn't it? I mean, it feels like a rebellion. It feels like you're not doing, I don't know, whatever cleaning or useful home learning or exercises or organizing or planning or whatever else, whatever other structures are meant to be in place, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's strange. I think I was looking back through photos from the very first lockdown yesterday in sort of preparation for this, because I kind of don't have much memory of it. I think it was somewhat traumatic, and I have all these beautiful photos of my little boy having the absolute time of his life. I was completely losing my mind, but he, we completely embraced play. we transformed a tiny flat into this play space, and we had a paddling pool on the balcony, and like ridiculous things like this, you know. And it was, yeah, looking back on it, I can sort of see the beauty and the creativity in it. But at the time, it just felt like pressure and failure, mostly.
Yeah, and really traumatic.
Yeah.
It's really funny. I had the same experience. I was looking at, I mean, we've got videos. We've got these really elaborate cardboard masks that we did, videos of the kids acting out. Maybe that sounds too sounds too structured. You know, the Gruffalo, but just the rhymes becoming part of your everyday life. The kind of whatever the rules of play. I always mention this. I've got it here. This you know, Huizinga. I don't know how you pronounce his name, but in Homo Ludens, he's got this quote where he talks about this kind of space of play, and I just copied it in the text, where he watches his friend's child. I think so. To his friend, "Don't kiss the engine, daddy, or the carriages won't think it's real." And this kind of knowing that it's pretend, but engaging with it in complete seriousness, but then allowing ourselves to do that. Not because it's useful. I mean, saying that play can be useful or instrumentalized in a way kind of defies the point, but just because it's fun and just kind of
Yeah.
but then still being able to think about it, I think, is key. I mean, we go back to this idea of how do we feed this into our work? How do we bring this into our practice? How do we make this, how do we foreground, I don't know, situatedness, emotion, these negotiations, even the voices of children in this kind of, in the work that we're doing in our own practices?
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated, and I suppose, like, do you feel like COVID just brought that to the fore for you? It seems like that's in the background of your research, and it's made that more of a.
It's I think it did. Yeah, I mean, someone asked me to talk at something about research methods, and I found that the only thing I could talk about were my children because that was all I was doing, and so I started thinking about these kind of interactions as a research method, and again, not in a way that instrumentalizes them, but in a way that takes that acknowledges, I guess, this kind of collaborative meaning making. I don't know, collaborative. This dialogue, right? This kind of play.
Yeah, I think dialogue's a really important term, because it's like like you say, you don't want to just fall into that sort of capitalist trap of having to make everything have the same kind of value. Like, everything has to be productive, and but at the same time, you want the value of things like play to be really understood, because it does have a value. It's just not quite the same kind of value, and
and as a value in itself, rather than a value for, I don't know. You're right. Productivity, I think, is the kind of the culprit here. What we want to, what we want to avoid.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
As a concept. So one of the very few example I've found of ways in which kids are brought. Do you know about Bateson's metalogs? Let me try and I've got a. So Bateson, I think he's a psychologist, but he wrote this book called Steps to an Ecology of Mind, and it begins with, I've got his definition here. It begins with this section called metalogs that are discussion between himself and his daughter, who was a child at the time. And this is how he defines it. So that's a quote from his book. And he says, a metalogue is a conversation about some problematic subject. This conversation should be such that not only do the participants discuss the problem, but the structure of the conversation as a whole is also relevant to the same subject. So they're kind of performative dialogue pieces. And the definition makes it sound poncier than what it actually is, because so the titles are, for example, why do things get in a muddle? And then, so that's the question from his daughter, and then he, tries to make sense of it. And there's this conversation at an equal footing that still understands the power dynamic, that still knows that there's a performance involved in that kind of question and the line of questioning. And yeah, so we're still within that pretend space of play, right? But we're just kind of allowing it to do its thing and understanding that there's understanding there, you know, that there's something there there's meaning there. I don't know what the right word for that is.
Yeah, it's like a very specific kind of space that you're opening up, which it makes me think of, like, some people discuss the sort of the therapeutic space as like a very particular space that happens between two people, or the kind of space between a viewer and an artwork, or it's that very particular things happen in that space between two people or two objects, or, you know, and that kind of engaging with a child is a very particular version of that, because their grasp on reality is somewhat different to ours in very interesting,
special.
yeah, in absolutely wonderful ways, I think. Definitely. And to bring neurodiversity into it as well, like my son is autistic, and that's another sort of layer of that, like learning from how he plays when he's not being kind of expected to play in the ways that school deems appropriate.
Yeah, follow particular rules, right?
Yes, when he's allowed to follow his special interests, for instance, and things like that. It's it's not necessarily what other people would understand as play, but it's stunningly beautiful very often. So
and messy, I imagine. But it's what you're saying. I mean, it's about
that. I don't know if I can. Put a photo.
Have you got a picture?
Does this work? I don't know how I do that. Do you know? Does anyone know how to put a photo in the chat?
Oh, maybe there's an attach thing somewhere. Not sure. Oh, maybe copy and paste. Do you have it as a document?
I will try that. Oh yeah, there you go. I mean, this doesn't reflect the sheer hours of dominoes that we played. This is slightly more freestyle play, but this is him on our balcony. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Yes.
Showing up.
Yeah, no, that looks familiar.
We did this. Bubble box. Yeah.
We accidentally did something like that with flour.
Right.
Yeah, and by accidentally, I mean, there was no. Yeah, none of the grown-ups were in control. But we did join in, which I think, I mean, again, it's that because it is again about challenging these hierarchies. You know, why does play look a particular way? Why are particular experiences more relevant? Why are particular things prioritized again? So this idea of challenging, I guess, these structures.
Yeah, and again, going back to the idea of care and power structures within care, and kind of care not necessarily being nice, and like some of the care that people have tried to give my son has been quite damaging, and because they're trying to force him into neurotypical ways of being. So yeah, there are kind of added challenges for some people when it comes to care, or to lots of people. Yeah.
And then there's that rule, the rule making that comes with parenthood. It's a funny balance, isn't it? So it's like, our understanding of, again, the limitations of care, right? Our understanding of what they need, our what we can do about it as well, and then how we fit it around our practice, whatever that is.
Yeah. And hopefully what we learn from it, ideally. We learn from that. I know that's a bit of a cliche, sort of learning from your kids, but I do think there's a lot of truth in that if you're open to it.
Yeah. No, I think because I think Helena's giving us a sign that it might be time. I think that this idea of learning from it is a really good way of concluding for now. And I think that's what we're looking into, right? When we're talking about articulating, when we're talking about, I don't know, collaboration, meaning making, foregrounding. I think there's learning, but not in the sense of productivity, but just in the sense of celebrating, taking in, I don't know, acknowledging.
Yeah, it's living.
Living, yes.
Living. Yeah.
That's great. We should make t-shirts.
We should just living.
Just living.
Excellent. I'm sure we could get Daisy involved in that.
Yeah, that'd be great. We'd love to hear. I mean, yeah, so there'll be time for chatting at the end, but thanks to everyone contributing in the chat as well.
Yeah, thank you, Nicola. I couldn't quite respond to your, I don't quite have the executive function to respond as you're saying things, but those are some really great comments, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, and perhaps we can come back to some of those things in the Q&A as well, and the discussion at the end. Yeah, thank you very much, Lina and Anna. That was really, really interesting. Yeah, I'm just going to hand over to Daisy and Emma, who are going to be talking in the next section. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that Colette has been able to join us today, but yeah, we've got Daisy and Emma here.
That's great. Wow, what an interesting conversation.
Absolutely. Daisy, I just have to tell you, the University of Brighton have just decided to restart everybody's laptops.
Oh, no.
I've now had to join you on my phone.
Okay.
Which is fine because we've got all the platforms, but it does mean that until this thing's kicked in, I'm not going to be able to share my presentation.
Maybe you could send it to someone while I'm speaking, and then they could, as like a backup.
Yeah, Emma, do email it to me, and then I'll post my email address in the chat, and then you can email it to me if you like.
Okay, we'll give it a go.
If that's straightforward.
Don't know if it will be. Daisy, you chat, and I'll see what I can work out.
Yeah. Daisy, go for it.
Okay, great. Well, it's great. It's a great conversation to follow because parenthood is it's like quotidian. It's your everyday experience, and you're bringing it into it. You're re-examining it through a new lens. And that's almost what Emma and I and what Colette was going to do today was we want to take something that for us is quite quotidian, it's every day, it's part of our lives, and bring it into the limelight, essentially. So I'm honored today to be joined by, at the moment, Emma, who's a creative, but she's also a crafter like I am, which is an already accepted form of creativity. What we also do is we create audiovisual content on social media, and therefore we can call ourselves content creators. Now, when I say the word content creator, it just makes me feel really yucky because it sounds like something that belongs to the world of marketing, and not something that it's not something that you'd necessarily associate immediately with the idea of creativity. But hopefully, I'm in a safe place now where I can say it out loud, and all of you have come to learn a little bit more about what content creation is, how it can be a craft, and what it has to do with the home. Okay, so Emma is a freelance researcher, designer maker, and her work focuses on how collaborative making on social media can encourage sustainable actions. She's also the author of a number of zero-waste craft books and lectures at the University of Brighton in the dark arts of digital content creation. She's also a Kingston University alumni. Colette, so I don't know if she will be able to join us, but if she pops up eventually, she's a TikToker, but a Louisiana-born artist whose work focuses on her queer and Southern identity. And she was going to share with us her own experience as an artist online. And then I'm Daisy Bowe. I'm a crafter. I'm a research student at the Kingston School of Art, and I'm actually learning to proudly call myself a content creator. This is a new title that I've recently realized I need to empower me when I use it. Okay, so to start off, did you know that the other day I saw a Harry Styles cardigan in the wild? Yes, it was just there, standing before me, waiting to cross the street. And hopefully you know what I'm talking about, but it's the color block patchwork cardigan that he wore in February 2020, just before the lockdown hit. And his Generation Z fan base became so obsessed with the cardigan, which costs £1,250, that they all came together to learn and share patterns of how to make it on TikTok. So the designer, J.W. Anderson, was so touched that they actually released a free pattern so the fans could make it themselves. And if you see, there's a quote here where he says, I'm so impressed and incredibly humbled by this trend and everyone knitting the cardigan. I really wanted to show our appreciation. But the thing is that it will still cost you £100 in materials to make. And obviously for anyone who's ever tried to make anything, even IKEA furniture, it takes a lot of skill and time in order to perfect it. So I've seen a lot of handmade items in the wild recently. I've seen it in the shops. I've seen it by young people proudly wearing their amateur knits on the high street. And I'm not just talking about like seeing it in the public eye, such as Tom Daley knitting on the Olympic stage, or even Bernie Sanders mittens. I'm talking about seeing everyday people proudly adorning their creations, or just happily embroidering on the train. And I love this image here. It's a TikTok video of someone dancing to an audio, and the title, it says, "I've spent 30K on university, but spending most of my time crocheting." So it's happening. People are making. And in fact, Kingston University actually saw the foundation of its first double image, its first Stitch and Bitch Society this academic year, where a number of undergraduates would meet on a Tuesday to learn how to crochet. And I've been at Kingston 10 years, and I've never seen students come together to crochet. So that's been an interesting development. So I'm not just observing this out and about in the real world, I'm actually seeing it on my Instagram feed. And in fact, that's where I first started to see it. So while the multiple lockdowns have pushed more towards their screens to connect, and many did use this unprecedented time to learn a craft, or thinking about the previous talk, to keep their children occupied, or even use their craft to make an income, I believe it only accelerated an already growing phenomenon that was being fueled by online craft communities, specifically and more recently, Instagram. This is really interesting because there's been a dramatic reduction in formal craft education, yet the UK market for craft has notably grown since 2006. And this is according to some research that was published during the pandemic, obviously conducted before, by the Crafts Council, and they revealed that 73% of UK adults bought craft in 2019. And almost a third of those buying the handmade are under 35. These are the digital natives. So as Emma will elaborate later, I hope, but craft never really went away. But what we do have now is access to online social media platforms that enable users to bypass traditional gatekeepers. Gatekeepers like galleries and shop fronts and broadcasters. And users can curate a public-facing profile and thus connect with like-minded people. Why go to the Royal School of Needlework when you can literally learn some of their curriculum from their teachers on YouTube? And or buy a kit from your favorite craft influencer? Why exhibit at a gallery that will only be able to get your work presented to a limited amount of viewers when you can sit on your couch and display your work online and amass millions of views? And these views have an impact. So for example, this is also a Kingston alumni, a Kingston graduate. He's Denzel Curry, and he's known as Curry Goat on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And he is known for creating content around rug tufting. And what's significant about rug tufting is that it was considered a critically endangered craft. It was considered at risk of becoming extinct as a practice in the UK. And when the Heritage Craft Association discovered that there were lots of young people rug tufting on TikTok, they have a quote here at the bottom, "Rug tufting is gaining popularity and has seen a surge of interest fueled by social media and TikTok." Last year, in their most updated list of endangered crafts, they've deemed it currently viable. So it begs us to question, are some of these new tufters part of the millions who follow someone like Curry Goat's content? And therefore, have they been influenced? I woke up to 1 million views the other day. The video now has I can see it's like 7.2 million views. And I, as a result, received many orders in my online shop. Now, while I haven't been able to nurture a large following on Instagram, even though I joined in 2011, I've posted religiously, I missed the 2016 to 2018 influencer wave. However, I was able to jump on the back of the TikTok wave just in time to nurture a following, which has somehow more recently grown to 100,000 people. And, you know, I'm being modest here. It's not just something I did. It took a lot of work, a lot of experimentation, and a lot of observation. And to do this work, I used the skills that I gained by observing others over the last 16 years, which sounds weird, but I've been on social media for 16 years, and I've self-taught myself how to make content. So you see, there isn't necessarily a handbook on how to do this, on how to create content. Users have to teach themselves, and they have to learn from each other. It's like a knitting pattern that we all adapt. We learn through making. We learn where to find the right tools or even apps that live basically in the palm of your hand. And the really tough part is that the rules of the game are constantly changing because of the new gatekeeper. And this new gatekeeper is the algorithm. Instagram and other platforms are constantly changing what it wants its users to do in order for us to reap a good harvest. Okay, so that's reach. We want our content to be placed before others, and most importantly, our own community, the people who follow us, and often the algorithm doesn't do that. So an example, the way I try and explain to people who aren't on social media, the algorithm's kind of like the gods, and us content creators have to make a sacrifice. So we have to give the gods something in order for something in return. So on Instagram, it might be posting your content at a particular time, or using a particular audio that's trending that day. So you really have to have your finger on the pulse and know what do the gods want today, this week, this month, in order for us to reap a successful harvest. So what's even more fascinating is that we're using these mobile devices and platforms to invite people into our homes and our lives. We're broadcasting our own self-produced Kardashian-esque show. And it's here in this domestic space that we start to see the similarities between craft and content creation emerge. Both craft and social media have a reputation of being looked down upon in the hierarchy of the arts. Is this because both craft and content creation can be self-taught outside the bounds of the formal institutions? And how is it associated with women's work? Well, anyone can just see a cardigan and theoretically make it. Anyone can also take a photo and post it. But if you've ever tried to craft anything well at least, it takes learning, practice, and skill in order to execute it successfully. And therefore, the question I pose is content creation a craft activity? And where will our online craft content creators sit in our history books and archives? While the V&A Museum has since acquired the Harry Styles cardigan for its permanent collection, I do wonder how, in this digital dark age that we're living through, I wonder how self-taught rug tufters with 201,000 followers who've influenced others to take up this recently critically endangered craft, whose impact on the craft world is in many ways immeasurable, how will they be held in the archives for future generations to study? That's it. Great. And if Emma, I don't know how have you worked out your
It's all okay. I've managed to turn it back on. I think we're in. Thank you for that, Daisy. It's really, so Daisy and I have been on a similar journey. I've started my PhD. Daisy's just getting there, so we've kind of been chatting about these sorts of things for quite a while now. And as she said, we actually met when I was a student at Kingston, and I've been an Instagram influencer now for 7 years, which is a long old time. And it is really interesting to see how the dynamics shift within that as the algorithms change and all those sorts of things. So actually what I wanted to do was just talk a bit about craft, because I'm a craft influencer. But for me, craft and the domestic sphere, we're talking about home, is deeply gendered, which we've already sort of touched on. And I will just get up my slides and just start doing it rather than telling you what I'm going to do. Let's find it here. Can everybody see that? Marvelous. Okay, so there's this amazing paper by a woman called Fiona Hackney. If you're into craft history or any design activism, she talks about a willingness to reclaim the history of domestic crafts, engagement with notions of everyday activism, agency and ingenuity, and a desire to act independently are all defining characteristics of the new super connected amateur who, while not necessarily a trained craft person, draws on a wide range of knowledge and experience to contribute to an expanded notion of what craft might be. And I think that's what Daisy was kind of starting to allude to a bit about. How do we start to reframe maybe what making through our phones is classed as? Fiona Hackney's fascinating, and I don't know if any of you have read any of Otto von Bersch's work, but both of those guys, like, mind-blowing, fascinating, deeply interesting people to talk to read around these sorts of areas. But so what I wanted to do was just kind of embed this in what actually does craft mean. So we refer to it as an activity involving skill in making things by hand. It's also a skill used in deceiving others. And actually there's been this kind of real relationship between those two things and this kind of gendered notions of femininity for what's now like 200 years or something. And this started when the Victorians really, they were the ones that really kind of split apart the public and the private sphere, and that women's kind of roles were within the home and becoming good home managers and caring, and all the kind of ideologies and things that the lovely ladies just now were talking about, these kind of caregiving roles. And what's quite interesting, I haven't put the quote here, is that a sewing kit used to be called a housewife. they were kind of named as the same thing. So these kind of domestic craft skills, and I'll talk in a moment about that difference between high craft and domestic craft, were very much seen as a part of a feminine identity. So they've really evolved together. And one way women were allowed to come out into the public sphere, having been, you know, kind of kept in that private sphere, was actually through making. So things like the WI were spaces they were allowed to go where they weren't necessarily thought of being politicized too much, because there was a big fear about that with the suffrage movement and stuff like that. But the most requested activities to learn were things like were handcrafts. And it's partly because my feeling is that it's because these kind of soft domestic crafts become a real form of agency for women. They're able to create and define their identities through these sorts of making activities, where in spaces when they wouldn't have had another sort of voice. And it really came to the fore during the 1940s, where you've got make, do, amend, and all of a sudden those domestic skills are pushed out into the world because they're needed. So you get all these examples of make, do, amend's the big one, but women were knitting code into jumpers, like through kind of different stitch patterns and stuff. There were lots of uses for these domestic crafts coming forward. And then in the 50s, there was something like, oh, get back indoors. And, you know, there's this kind of real shift, and you get the kind of boiling undercurrent of people like Simone de Beauvoir, who are writing about kind of how you start to liberate women. But it was also at this time in the 50s that they took craft, which was suddenly, you know, now in the world, and said, oh, we need to kind of give this a hierarchy. We're going to make it high craft. And they did that by using the kind of rules of the arts and saying, OK, we're going to measure to be a formal kind of artistic craft. It has to be conceptual, and it has to have these kind of levels of material and technical finesse. And so actually you're using what is technically a masculine form of identifying and grading, like a guild style way of getting in. And so those crafts were sort of taken and redefined. So the ones that women were still doing in the home were still kind of put on the back seat. But what's really interesting as we then move forward, Fiona Hackney talks about how devalued activities as crochet and knitting can be envisaged as strategies or tactics that afford agency and shape distinctive social relations. And she's writing about that now, but it was absolutely the same back in the 60s and 70s when crochet came forward as the kind of the tool of the countercultural movement. It, you know, really represented everything within that dress. And again, it's about having some sort of agency about your own, how you're perceived in the world, and using it as a countercultural movement. Then everything starts to change from the 80s as women go into the workplace, and we were already talking earlier about that kind of imbalance. So what happened is, as women go into the workplace, you think there's this perceived notion that there's some sort of equality going on, but what happens is it doesn't then go the other way. Men don't come back into the household. There's not like a paradigm shift in how everybody's kind of functioning now. It just means that women who were supposed to be managing the households and still had all of those chores, we still do, as there's been loads of interesting research over the pandemic about how women are still carrying 4/5 of the domestic duties, even though we're all working well, 3 out of 4 of us are working full time. And so, you know, there's not an actual democratized state in terms of who gets to do what. It's still really one-sided. And those traditional skills, weren't kind of valued anymore, because what women now want to see themselves as are being able to pay their own mortgage and having this kind of different identity about themselves, but also there's no time. And so what I was thinking this morning is actually we think that those things weren't popular, but actually they've never gone away. What happened is the narrative around how you should be functioning in the world has changed. So rather than being encouraged to make and mend things, all of a sudden women as spenders should buy shit, like go and buy stuff. And Primark opens in the early noughties, and there were like people hospitalized for the desire for cheap goods. But you know, this is all women's wear, and this is all adding to that massive amount of stuff that's heading into landfill, that huge like triplicating of stuff that's being thrown away and not being repaired and not being mended. And it's for these kind of, you know, complicated reasons. But then what really interests me is how on the internet, we explore new publics, engage with new audiences, and above all, glitching between new conceptions of bodies and selves. And this is from Glitch Feminism by Legacy Russell. She's kind of proposing it as the beginning of a fourth wave feminism. And what's really interesting about it for me is actually how our smartphones, as extensions of ourselves, are allowing us to recreate our identities. And this is why all of a sudden we've got things like gender fluidity suddenly coming to the fore. You're able to kind of start to define who you are, but also, and really importantly, who you connect with. So whereas before maybe women would have been sat down knitting at a table with another woman kind of, you know, while their kids are at school, we then kind of lost that communication and connectivity through craft. And like we said, it didn't go away, but actually now as outliers through these platforms like Instagram and TikTok, we're able to communicate with our communities of those like-minded people, so we can start to share that stuff that does really excite us. And so, you know, you talk about how influencers influence, actually there's already an appetite there for it. So this kind of notion of what the smartphone does for us, I think is fascinating. And there's loads of really great papers on it. And one of them I really loved. I haven't got any of my quotes about who wrote this stuff. I will find it for everyone later if they want it. But this is about how the smartphone actually changes how we operate in the world. And one is through this functional node, which is where actually it becomes a part of us. It acts as our memory. It can act as an extension of ourselves. So it's a kind of part of it's a tool. It's almost like a part of my body in the world somewhere. And we talk about how, or rather Legacy Russell talks about, rather than using IRL, which is in real life, we should be using AFK, which is away from keyboard, because for me, most of my interactions now are in that digital realm. That is my real life. When I had kids, Facebook had happened and oh my God, it saved my life because I was going to go mad. Like these digital platforms really become an integral part of how we communicate. So it's all real. You know, we are just away from our keyboards when we're not in these spaces. So they function as our surrogate selves or portals into another part of our life, which I think is really important. They work in an anthropomorphic way. We kind of give them personality. We dress them up to look like us. They represent who we are. We load them with apps. We give them different covers. You know, they really kind of start to become an entity in themselves. And then this ontological understanding of how we know who we are. I was saying to Daisy recently, I had to stop posting on Instagram because I didn't know who I was without it. I genuinely had become so sort of blurred with this app in terms of what I was creating and what I was making. And the people I was talking to, it kind of totally affected who I was in the world. So it's a really interesting kind of dynamic. And they also allow us this geographical scales as entry points. So I've got a little picture here of my sewing box, this geographical space that I interact with to remake the world. So we've got relationships and differential capacities for remaking the world. This is an article about what smartphones do for us. My sewing box allows me to reimagine who I am. It's a tool full of other sorts of tools and materials that are of a physical nature, whereas my phone encompasses all these different apps which are tools of a digital nature that also allow me to create who I am in the world and make things as well. But those things, you know, if we start thinking of NFTs are things that can be sold, it's that same kind of notion of that digital art or digital making, which I find really exciting. So I know I talked really fast. I was trying to keep it to 10 minutes. I think there's lots of questions to be asked more than anything about who and how we are in the world through things like phones. What constitutes craft? So actually, if craft for me is if craft is, I can't remember who someone was saying it's like 10,000 hours is what it takes to become a craftsperson in your particular medium. I have definitely spent more than that in Instagram land, making things through different Snapseed and different kind of and Pixlr and apps. So does that make me a craftsperson as an Instagram creator, or actually is because it's all there for me, does that not count? Is it like buying a craft kit where I'm given the colours and I'm given the tapestry material and I'm just kind of remaking something that's already there? So there's a really interesting dichotomy in that for me, and I don't know what the answer is. But I do know that I really believe that those connections we make through those platforms are as real as the connections I make in real life. We've got David Gauntlet here. His book, Making Us Connecting, is hugely influential in my kind of work around this. I think it's a really, because I think digital is, as Daisy's kind of said, not quite frowned upon, but it comes from that domestic sphere, and what does it really mean and who is doing it? You know, these domestic crafts are still kind of not thought of as, you know, it's not a beautifully turned piece of wood or something. There's still a very gendered conversation that's going on around it. And I think those digital platforms are made by men. Most apps are probably made by chaps. We know that going into schools now, if you look at the number of boys choosing technology subjects against the number of boys choosing craft and making subjects, massively different, way more women in art colleges. I've got 2 boys in my particular course of 90 students and 88 girls. We've got, and art schools are just full of young women, aren't they? So actually we've got this kind of real gendered consideration about who's going where and doing what. Anyway, stop talking for a minute. Daisy.
That's great. I guess we go to questions now, I think.
Yeah, yeah, thank you both so much. That was really, really fascinating, really rich. And I just thought that I'd kind of come in with just something that I thought maybe connected a bit the two conversations, where and it's something that I think about a lot in my own research. But yeah, just the notions of value, and how it was the quote where you had, Emma, about like devalued activities of craft of Fiona Hackney, and it just seemed that so much of what all of you are talking about is about this thing of like, I see a value in this, and I can see kind of how rich and and worthy, in a sense, worthy of interest and attention all of this is. But yeah, if you're kind of you're the TikTok person, Daisy, or or the parents, it's these things of like, oh well, isn't that just something you do in your spare time? It's like a hobby, or care is just something that, oh yeah, just put that in the background, looking after your kids or something. And I just wondered if there was something that any of you wanted to respond to in relation to that, and ideas of value, and what you might be thinking about, like what knowledge is produced, or what is the value that you're creating with the work, or care, or whatever you want to call it, that you're doing. If that
well, I'm also just going to actually reply to Stephen at the same time, because he just mentioned The Subversive Stitch by Rosika Parker, which is a really seminal work around how feminine identity has absolutely kind of gathered momentum through kind of stitching. But I think it's a really interesting space to then start talking about craftivism, and actually how we talk about where is the value in these things. And actually it's these, Fiona Hackney talks about it as quiet activism. But craftivism is this movement where we're using the gentle arts of protest, is what it's called, different ways of engaging and talking about things in the world. And what I find really interesting is that's in a terribly feminine way of thinking about it, whereas you've got someone like Otto von Busch who talks about it as hacktivism, which is a much more kind of, it's the same principle, that you're interacting with the things that are already in the world, but from a very kind of masculine standpoint. Or Paul Micklethwaite, who was my lecturer at Kingston, has written a book called Beyond Recycling, and he talks about it as there being a need for, I think he calls it polysopia, which is how to create multi-layered meaning through existing objects, especially when we're talking about sustainability. And again, I find that an incredibly masculine kind of approach to what has been being done and never gone away for like the last 200 years in terms of kind of upcycling and remaking and all those sorts of things. So I think also when you look, I'm sorry, I will stop talking in a second. When you look in the kind of fashion industry as well, it's women that are trying to make changes. It's, I think we've never stopped, but it still seems, when you look at who has, we've already talked about the weight of domesticity in the home, and actually especially with sustainability, from the research I've been doing, actually that sits with women mostly. Men may come and build the wormery, but it's women that have to use it every day. It's these kind of different modes of being, and it's part of that bigger conversation about how we have to change the patriarchy to really make a shift in all these kind of ideologies and stuff. But that's the big challenging problem, isn't it? So actually, I think about it, for me, it's about personal agency and what can I do and where can I do it? And actually, that's what craft does for me.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I don't know if Lina, Anna, Daisy want to come in on any of that, or any other thoughts, or anything in relation to anything that's been in the chat so far as well. Yeah, Anna, yeah.
I really wanted to ask Daisy and Emma as well, if she wants to talk about it, just a bit more about the algorithm gods and your feelings about them, because there is this idea of us creating our own worlds through social media and being able to engage with such a broad world of stuff. But then there's also the fact that the algorithms are channeling people, which can be very, very dangerous, especially if someone starts a couple of steps on a a sort of journey of radicalization, for instance, or just other sort of how do you feel about the power that the algorithms have, and are there ways of subverting that, I guess?
Daisy, do you mind? I'll just go quick and then you can go. Daisy and I bemoan this a lot. I was in Instagram world from the beginning, when it was a very real-time thing where you were actually genuinely communicating and connecting with people when they were doing stuff, and then the algorithm gods came and changed because they want you to buy more stuff. What's interesting is how, so there are lots of other platforms. There's over 300 different social media platforms already in the world. We just use 2 of them. And so someone like Discord, for example, which is a more heavily used gamers platform, is privately owned. So there's no algorithm featured within it. You invite people in, you chat on it how you want to, you go away again. And there's lots of, I'm sure you probably know that Donald Trump has just started his own one called The News, so he can speak freely. And obviously Elon Musk's just bought Twitter. Like, there's this whole, what's really fascinating for me is, as these things developed, like in the press or whatever, through journalism, there are codes of conduct. You have to kind of, there are certain things that rule those spaces, so you know what you can say and how you're supposed to say it, and you could be held to account. But in social media world, it's all still new and no one's got those codes of conduct. So it just is, you know, anyone can come in and just turn it into another marketing platform all the way through. There's no kind of space or point at the moment where someone goes, hang on, you're destroying communities here, or you're interrupting these kind of very real experiences of people. And I think until we start to get to that point where we recognize the value of those platforms, because at the moment they're not valued as they're not IRL, they're just little apps. Actually, they're huge spaces with millions and millions of people on them, and we just don't understand, or we're still learning how to negotiate those things with them. Anyway, Daisy, you go.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, and often when I talk to my supervisors about this, there's a lot of things that I assume because I do it myself. So when I'm making content and sharing things, there's things that there's like ways of doing that I just assume that other people know how to do, because I follow other like crafters who make content and share it. But then when I speak to anyone, no one really understands that people know there's an algorithm, but they might not know that people sit down on a Sunday and they'll create all their content for the week, and then they will like schedule it to be posted, and is May the 4th coming up, and therefore you want to do something that's kind of Star Wars themed so that you can jump on something that's trending. It's like it's a whole different world. But in terms of the danger of the algorithm, it also differs from each platform. So on Instagram, you might be able to get away, and not me, but you might be able to get away with a bum pic if there's like a piece of art that you're sharing. But TikTok, do not post a bum, even if it's of David. Don't put a bum on TikTok because it will ban it. And then you have all these communities like the pole dancing community who can't use any of the terminology that refer to their what they do, because the algorithm will just not share it with anyone. So then communities have to invent their own language to get around the algorithm and create hashtags. So like even on TikTok at the moment, people because of the protection that they've built into the app, if you use the word suicide, sorry if that's a triggering word, but your content will not be shared. But so people use the word unalived. So there's a whole language that's forming around getting around the algorithm so that you can have your content seen. I don't know if that answers the question.
So just a question. Oh yeah, Kat, please. Do you want to?
No, thanks everyone. Really interesting discussions. And I've sort of got a half question, which I think I've got 2 questions. One of them is a half question, which is about this idea of being oppositional, because certainly the history of modern craft, this sort of idea of craft and the conditions of industrial and post-industrial modernity, is about opposition and alterity, and in a way, I think you're sort of already answering it. Like, is there an alternative? Is there a position of alterity in the context of social media, or do you have to, negate that as a platform to engage with, which is so different? I was thinking about if you reduce social media to just being a kind of publishing platform, which is obviously it's much more than that. The craft community or craft communities never really had before an issue with how their work was published. Like that was never really a kind of a site of contention, but it could be in the future. sorry, that's the half thought, half question. And then the other just point I wanted to make was about, and in fact comment on, was that all of those fascinating talks all brought the self as a researcher to the fore, in a way that challenges a lot of research. And I think it's in a right way, in the way that actually all research has that kind of that autobiographical element to it. All researchers have family of some description, to kind of massively oversimplify. So I just wanted to have your comment on that.
Yeah, should I comment on this? I really like your second. I like both your questions, Kat. Thanks for asking them. But what you were saying at the end about the this commonality about foregrounding the self or bringing in the self of the researcher, I've been thinking a lot about that. And when Emma, you were talking about craftivism and hacktivism, and I was thinking maybe we should call this mommyism, I don't know, motherism, something. Someone. I don't know if any of you have read Data Feminism, brilliant book. Catherine D'Ignazio, one of the authors, describes herself as a hacker mama in her biography, and I've always admired that. I totally agree, Kat. I mean, the thing that kept these ideas kept coming to the foreground whenever we start discussing ideas around decolonizing, ideas around recentering, ideas around what are we learning, what are we teaching, who are we talking to, what kind of structures of knowledge are we taking for granted, how do we challenge these, where do we find meaning, how do we celebrate these differences, how do we do that from within the institutions that are built on these structures as well. I mean, it's very obvious in academia. It's certainly obvious whether it's the algorithm gods or hierarchies of art and craft and high craft, etc. And certainly in social structures around care in all its dimension. So yeah, definitely something. Oh, matrivism. I like matrivism. Definitely something we that's in the foreground of certainly of my thinking around these ideas.
I'm just going to chop in there as well, just because and it's something, a conversation I have a lot with my supervisors as well about, obviously it's not about us as researchers, it's about that kind of wider, more meta conversation. What's really interesting for me is when we start to look at things like social media, TikTok is 75% used by women. Pinterest is 80% women, over 35 on Instagram is more women than men. So actually these tend to be kind of more, those spaces tend to be kind of women, people of my demographic, whereas things like Twitter are 80% men, and actually they have very different vibes as spaces to be in, which is, it's just really interesting, and my knowledge and what I'm bringing through my particular research is the fact that I'm using an account with 40,000 followers actually as a research experiment, and so I have to use that audience that I have within that space to kind of ask those questions around sustainability in my case. But it's just really interesting when you start to pull apart those sorts of platforms, who's doing what, where, and why.
Hi. Better late than never. I'm so sorry that I'm late. I am traveling currently and I changed time zones. And long story short, I did not adjust my alarm and I'm so sorry. But I'm here, so I would like to listen in now. So sorry.
Yeah, really nice to have you, Colette. No worries at all.
Thank you.
Yeah, we've just been having this kind of conversation, kind of around the craft and social media and then obviously and parenting in relation to Lina and Anna. And there was just something that I was just thinking just now, was about something that Maria had posted in the chat earlier about she's saying that she got pregnant during the first lockdown and how now as a 1-year-old girl, she says, in a way I still feel in lockdown with working from home, my research and caring responsibilities, I still feel isolated or out of touch with other people. And then I was partly thinking about, like, in a sense, Anna, Lina, like to what extent maybe your you know, you grapple with something similar, or like, you know, how do you kind of stay connected? And then maybe Emma and Daisy as well, that thing of like, you know, during the pandemic, like what, yeah, how phones and how those kinds of things, how they kind of create connection or disconnection maybe. But yeah, I don't know if there's anybody who wants to respond to that.
Yeah, thanks, Helena. I was I looked at that quote in the chat, and I didn't have a chance to pick it up during our there are limits to multitasking. But I remember from lockdown that the most one of the most terrifying thoughts for me was, because we didn't know how long this would last, right? Was what it would mean for socialization and community and that kind of thing for our children. And I was thinking of anyone who was a first-time mom at that time, and how awful it would have been. My lifeline at that time were children's centers, these kinds of mommy groups where it really doesn't matter what it's about, kids yoga, whatever it is, anything where you can just be with your screaming baby with other people and be part of that community, you know, leaky, smelly, sweaty, sleepless community of humans, of bodies, and the instructions, understandable, during lockdown was exactly the opposite of that. So just being these kind of separated units and things like that. And what we did was actually, well, in terms of our family, I mean, as I say, it was my second child, and she was a bit older anyway. But social media, you know, WhatsApp video chats with the family, birthdays on Zoom and Teams, you know, any way to connect. And I guess you guys, Emma and Daisy and Colette, are probably a bit more expert at that than us. I don't know.
Yeah, sorry, Colette. When I spoke just then, I didn't include you. I said Daisy, Emma, and I've just my brain working then. But of course, you do come in, and yeah, if you want to talk about your practice at all, like there's definite space and a bit of time for that as well.
Yeah, I apologize. I don't know how far along y'all have been, so I don't know if you still have time for like a little presentation of mine, but
yeah, I mean, how do people feel? You know, we could probably have, like, if it was quite a brief one, because we're aiming to finish at like 1:30. But does that feel okay with the other speakers? If Colette, yeah, and everybody.
Ironically, got to go and do the school run, which feels very interesting within this conversation. It's been really lovely to meet everybody. I'm really happy to answer questions later, but I'm going to sort of duck out.
Okay.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much, Emma. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma.
Take care. Yeah, Colette, please.
Are you sure? Because I honestly, I will not be offended if I can't present, because like it was just an honest mistake of like I moved from New York time zone to the Southern time zone here in the United States. So and then I was managing your time zone too, and I was just like completely off. So now that's why I'm like an hour late. So I totally understand that you guys have lives, like
Okay,
so,
Colette, I'd be interested to know a bit about how using social media as an artist has what's the relationship been like? How has it impacted what you make, where you sell it, how you communicate, the conversations you're part of?
Yeah, so you know, maybe I won't do a presentation, but I'll just do a quick little spiel about who I am and everything. So my name's Colette Bernard. I am a multidisciplinary artist. I have a bachelor's from Pratt Institute in New York, but I was born and raised here in the South of the United States in Louisiana. And I focus a lot on the internet in my fine arts practice, but also over the past 2 years, while I was finishing up my time getting my BFA, I really fell in love with content creation and the art of it, and began to take it more seriously as a tool and as a form of craft. And to answer your question, Daisy, I began using social media years ago as just a portfolio or a place to meet people. You know, I would scroll aimlessly looking to find people who created amazing work, you know. And whenever TikTok rolled around, it just like opened the floodgates of like it was a complete game changer, because at this point, like during the pandemic, Instagram was kind of already dead. It was really hard to find people organically. And that's not what it used to be like 5 years ago, where you could find people all the time. But I always say that Instagram is just it's no longer the wild wild west like it used to be. It's very predictable, and now TikTok has kind of assumed that role of being the place where you can meet a ton of people and connect people all over the world, which is how I met Daisy. And the way that I use social media in my practice is, not only do I use it as a like dumping ground for what I'm thinking about, or art theory discussions, talking about art history. I have a few series that I do, like public art, where I'll take the viewers to go see some public art, either in New York, or if I'm traveling, I'll do like an airport art series. But we also talk about art theory and have some really hard discussions about what it means to be an artist. And I think that I give a very reasonable and realistic glimpse into what that looks like. Like, I'll show what my side hustles are, how I run my business, how I keep this ball rolling. And it can be a really taboo subject for a lot of artists because of the idea of like the persona and everything. And I have really fallen in love with the idea of just being authentically myself online and seeing what happens, and it has been very rewarding. So yeah.
It's interesting that you use the word organic there so easily. And I just put in the comments that, because I use the word organic reach, and I think we as content creators I don't know if that's a word that's used elsewhere, but Instagram, all platforms have this beautiful time period where it wants people to use it, and therefore it treats you well, and it will share your content it will connect you with others. And the reason I did well on TikTok is because I'd missed the chance on Instagram. LinkedIn had a brief moment, podcasts had a brief moment. TikTok is very much slowly coming out of that moment where you can get organic reach, and you have to play more and more into that. What does the algorithm want from me today? I mean, you'll always have to be strategic, perhaps, if you want to grow a following. There's always some kind of pattern and I just want to add something that I heard from someone who runs Reddit. I can't remember their title. He was saying, for anyone who wants to create content, the last thing you should do is walk into a space and start making content. Like, the last thing you should do is walk in and start a conversation. You got to treat it like a dinner party. You got to go onto the platform. You have to participate and listen to the conversation, have an understanding as to what the topic is about, and then you can find where you can bring your ideas into it. And I thought that was really clever. He was using it in a brand context. So how can you brands go in and pretend that you're real people so people will buy stuff from you? But yeah, that's what to do.
Yeah, I feel like social media is, I've heard, I mean, here's the reality is, it's like, it almost doesn't even matter how good your art is. If you're not there for the right reasons, people know, and I would say that I've met close to 500 new artists in the past 2.5 years because of TikTok, which is amazing and insane. And I never even would have met that many people in New York City getting a bachelor's degree, like it's crazy. But I can tell the difference between someone who's there to make community and engage in the politics of the application, and what does it mean to be a part of this space online. And there's even like etiquette of like what's considered appropriate ways to engage with each other, or like, for example, if someone's like randomly critiquing other artists in the comments, you might get a bad reputation with the rest of the art community online. It's like stuff like that. Like, it's a whole thing. So and I think that's really beautiful. I know there's some people who think that it's like sad, or, oh, everybody's online, and it's like, yeah, but like, I have friends across the world now. Like, I think that's really awesome.
I'm going to add one more thing to that, just because Emma was talking about this when we had a chat the other day. And she says that when she talks about how she makes work in response to her audience, it's always looked down upon as a negative thing. Oh, you make work and just, you make stuff online, and that video did well, therefore you do more of that. And she just thought, why do people look down upon because it's community making really, but for some reason it's just seen as I don't know, it's like icky. And I want to work to try and change that.
I guarantee you no one told that to Andy Warhol whenever the soup cans did really well. I mean, come on, you know.
It's kind of interesting, this thing about technology. Well, there's generational things happening, right? And there's also how comfortable you are with particular technologies. And I mentioned earlier that Sherry Turkle is really good in our relationships with technologies and how we negotiate lives and interactions through them. But what you just said, Colette, reminded me of, you know, we had to move all teaching online very suddenly at the beginning of the lockdown. And I was just back from mat leave, so I hadn't met the students I was going to teach ever in real life. And it was really interesting how just using the technology by just sheer effort of reaching out and connecting to one another through it, we actually made, so this is the graduating class from this year, last year's second year students. My colleague Chris and me are really established really meaningful, powerful connections with these students, just because we were trying, you know, as we are now, we're all online now, aren't we? Trying really hard to connect via these technologies, via this media, not using, yes, they separate us, and yes, it's less leaky and bodily and sweaty and all of these things that Anna and me are really interested in foregrounding, but there is still ways in which you can reach out through the technology.
Yeah, and you know, I always tell people too who are like looking to get into it that it's kind of toxic to look at social media as like, I'm going to get on here and intentionally want my art to go viral, or like, and I think that's like the whole like thing that Daisy was talking about, where it's like it gets kind of icky at some point. And I do think that there's something to be said about like there's like a very like gluttonous aspect to that like mindset, you know. But for the most part, like if you get on social media and you're just honest and you use it as a portfolio or whatever, it can be very rewarding. And also sometimes people don't even like whatever it is. I've seen plenty of artists who will accidentally go viral, and I'll say like, accidentally, like, what do you mean? Like, you posted it online, you know? And then they'll be very upset at the amount of emails they've gotten or something. And I don't know, it's just it's very fascinating. Something that I've studied for a while now is just the concept of like the artist and the influencer, and where do these two things overlap, where do they differentiate. And I've even had an interesting time myself trying to figure out like, you know, not to bring up Andy Warhol again, but I think he is a great example of, I always like to joke that he was the first influencer, because, you know, because of my TikTok being what it is, like every now and then I'll work with a brand, or I will find myself talking about like my home life or something I'm doing that has nothing to do with my art. And it's just interesting how it's the same platform that I'm on to only talk about my art or art related subjects. Or it's also interesting hearing people say like, oh, well, like I actually have never seen your art before. I've only seen your videos talking about art history or your public art series. And I just think it's very fascinating. Like, having my foot in both of those doors, and it's very paralyzing sometimes too.
Sorry that I think I'm going to have to draw this to a close. We'll have to, yeah, things to probably to get back to, but I'm just going to pass over to Stephen just for, yeah, final words.
Yeah, thanks, Helena, and thank you very much to our guest speakers, to Anna, to Emma, to Colette, also to Daisy and to Lina for arranging their two parts of this really fascinating, illuminating event. Also to Helena for coordinating everything. And many thanks to everyone for attending, for participating in the discussion. So we hope to see at least some of you again for the final event of this series, which will be on the 10th of June. And that one will be with a 6:30 p.m. start. And I think Helena is going to post a Eventbrite Live. Oh, have you just done it, Helen? That's great. Yeah, thanks very much.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much. Thanks for coming and listening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.